The early Tudor elite, the nobility and gentry, 1450–1530. Perhaps I should explain that the Tudors were the society that ruled England, Wales and Ireland from 1485 to 1603. They are of Welsh origin. The most famous Tudors are Henry VIII with his 6 wives and his break with Rome, and his daughter Queen Elizabeth, the last Tudor. But I'm not going to talk about the monarchs as such. I'm going to talk about the people immediately under them, the elite, the nobility and gentry. Nowadays, people are either embarrassed to talk about the traditional landed hierarchy, feeling they'll be accused of snobbery, or they're frivolous about it, whether in the debunking way, making fun of the aristocracy, or in a sort of snobbishly social climbing sense. They name drop. We name drop that we know the Earl of so-and-so. But the landowning class is not taken that seriously, even though it's richer than it pretends to be. However, for most of history, it was basically a very important reality, a fact of life. The landowners were the most powerful people in England. In fact, I would say, sweepingly, they were most powerful people over most of Europe and Asia in their various guises. To take a society totally remote from ours, what about the samurai of Japan, in old Japan? But I can't talk about the whole world, or half the world, so I'll focus much more narrowly on the elite of early Tudor England. Well, it was a stratified society. There was none of the sometimes slightly hypocritical moves to verbal equality, social equality we have nowadays. In fact, it was considered society should be the absolute opposite, a triangle with a very broad base and a very narrow apex, with the king at the very apex and the nobles and gentry and higher clergy just underneath. This fact was illustrated by the sumptuary laws, which were usually broken anyway, but which laid down that each category of each social category should wear certain sorts of clothes, very rich and elaborate for the nobles, and gradually getting soberer and soberer. But people didn't obey these laws. Nevertheless, these laws were there. Can you imagine people laying that down today? Let's look at the subdivisions of the elite. The baronage, or what we'd call the peers, were an elite of elites. Even so, they had their own divisions, from dukes to ordinary barons. In fact, one baron, Lord Clifford, accused his son of behaving like a duke's son rather than a poor baron's son. It's rather odd for a baron to think of himself as humble, but I suppose compared with the duke or king he was. They were around 60 families, remaining remarkably constant in number through the period, although different families. Obviously some died out and were replaced. They had many privileges. They had their own House of Parliament, which they retained until a week or so ago, at the time I'm speaking. In fact, when Mr. Blair's just abolished the right of hereditary peers. Even so, not all of them. They also had the dubious privilege, which they're probably glad has gone, of being beheaded rather than hung or burned if they were accused of treason. They could only be tried for a crime by their peers. They had great social respect. And, of course, in theory at least, they had great wealth. Then there were the gentry. They were themselves divided into knights, who were called sir, although they didn't inherit it, esquire, which came after your name, just below the knights. Both these categories had coats of arms, which were often forged by the heralds. You bribed the herald to forge you a coat of arms, whereby you claimed you came over with William the Norman 500 years before, even though you were a new knight and your grandfather had made all the money. Then there were the plain gentry. Unlike in France, there was no legal definition of plain gentry. You were a gentleman if people accepted you as a gentleman. It was rather circular. It depended on maintaining a gentle way of life, being more elaborate and extravagant than a yeoman or a merchant who was just underneath. That brings us to lifestyle. A gentleman was supposed to have superfluous servants. Unlike a middle-class man, a yeoman or a merchant who would only employ the servants he needed, gentlemen had servants hanging around who were often not doing very much, but they were in his uniform or livery, and he had to live in a house which was recognisably a manor house rather than simply a large farmhouse, although the distinction was a bit vague. And he had to keep open house and hospitality to entertain a lot of hangers-on, and was supposed to entertain the poor, which partly explains, this need to keep up the lifestyle, partly explains why earls, the top of the elite, who had incomes of between 3,000 and 4,000 a year, which is equivalent of an income of £1 million a year now, or more, were often in debt, were often bankrupt. They were forced to spend money, or said they were. Specific aspects of this lifestyle, diet and clothes, meat, especially game, and wine were the keynotes of elite consumption. Meat, they went round hunting it for themselves. It was another part of being noble or gentle. You hunted the boar and the deer. They also ate extraordinary variety of things, swans, for example. As for the wine, until very recently, wine in England has been a keynote of riches or distinction, because it's very difficult to produce it here. So they imported and drank a lot of wine from France, claret. It wasn't a very healthy diet. It led to gout and obesity, especially as you not only had to eat these things, but you were supposed to eat them in great quantity. Feasting, an idea inherited from Anglo-Saxon times, from very early times. You held elaborate feasts in your hall and stuffed yourself. You can see that best with the portrait of Henry VIII. After all, the king was only in a way the biggest noble. How fat he got. Henry VIII had a slim suit of armour in 1513 when he was young. By 1543 his suit of armour was huge, and you can see that in the Armoury Museum in the Tower of London. Vegetables and fruit were not enough in evidence, and milk products were despised as peasant fare, so it was rather unhealthy. Clothes were rich in imported fabrics, see the sumptuary laws, silk, slashed, gorgeous ruffs, everything. Livery and maintenance now, good lordship. What does that mean? Private armies and clientage, really. All these superfluous servants were not just there for show. In the disturbed conditions, civil wars of 15th century England, the Wars of the Roses, they formed private armies. This was called bastard feudalism, paying people to back you up. So many nobles were sort of aristocratic gangsters, like the Duke of Norfolk of the 1470s, who went round with a gang of thugs frightening people. There are other forms of clientage, of course. Judges were often bought, and juries, so they'd bring in verdicts according to their patrons' wishes, rather like in a western of the American West. There were some similarities. Priests often easily forgave sins if they were in the Lord's service, The Lord confessed to them and they gave them easy penance, and so on. Lawyers would find forms of words whereby their lord had the incontrovertible right to a piece of land rather than a rival or a poorer person. This brings us to sources of income. Land especially, in various forms of rents. Also the profits of plunder of war, very common up to 1530, at first at home, and then after the Tudors established internal peace, abroad. Extortion, indeed, until the Tudors, a stronger monarchy, started to deal with it, extorting money out of more defenceless people. Then pensions from the royal court. You try to get a pension or an office from the royal court, where you hope for a minimum of work and a maximum of income. And perhaps payments for genuine services. Minor gentry often worked for the earls as stewards or administrators or lawyers. Not all gentry relied on their land. Now, some of the above are a degeneration and corruption of two quite legitimate activities. The military activity, leading the king's armies, which is what the gentry or the nobles were supposed to do, or officers of them if they're gentry, and the landholding. The trouble was, in the 15th century, in the Wars of the Roses, nobles often commanded armies against the king of the day. The Tudors, however, put a firm stop to that. And they also tried to make landowners obey the law rather than going for extortion. Leisure, we've dealt with that a bit. Hunting and hawking, jousting, which was a ritualised form of the nobles' military function. Feasting and minstrels, people singing to you. You've probably all seen them in idealised films of the court of King Arthur, which has nothing to do with King Arthur, who would have existed at all around 500 AD, but is a high medieval view of how kings should behave. Education, the nobles, especially the boys, got a reasonable basic education. They'd be taught some French and Latin, simple arithmetic and history, a bit of law. At the age of 12, they often went away to be pages in the house of another great noble. Or if their father was a gentry, a simple gentleman, he'd try and get them accepted as pages into the house of the local great earl. This died out by the 1580s, which was going strong in our period. So pages, you've probably seen in romantic views of the Middle Ages, actually existed. Universities up to 1530, not many nobles went to university, and relatively few gentry. They were still regarded as for men of humbler origin wanted to make their way through the church. But some gentry who wanted to go into the church had to go to university, younger sons and nobles. Also some went to the Inns of Court, which were a sort of third university in England, and picked up some law, also had a lot of fun, and picked up some social graces. So gentry and nobles would need to know some law. So altogether, it was a good life if you could get it, which explains why people tried to get into the gentry. How were they recruited? Well, plain gentry, sometimes from younger sons of gentry themselves, who made enough money as merchants to buy an estate, sometimes from merchants and yeomen, that's wealthy farmers, who got enough, or lawyers, got enough money to climb into the gentry. The aristocracy, the titled people, were recruited from the gentry. To jump up from, say, being a middle-class merchant to being a baron, let alone an earl, was unheard of that period. But although the theory was that people didn't rise and fall in the social scale, of course they did, and everyone, as now, was trying to scrabble up to get a bit higher in the social scale, and a measure of success was if you ceased to be regarded as a merchant or yeoman and were regarded as a gentleman. Then the sky was the limit. Maybe in two generations' time you'd become an earl. A very good example of that is the Spencer families, from whom the ill-fated Princess Diana, Princess of Wales, comes, who around 1500 were wealthy sheep farmers and were earls after 1600, and gentry in the meantime.